Well, wonderful. Great to be with you, ladies and gentlemen. As it happens, I am Australian, but I'm actually based in the United States these days in Washington, DC. So, like Jeffrey, I'm up a bit late, but there you go. It's the perils of being an academic. Look, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm really enjoying this panel so much so far. And I'm presuming, Pitchamon, you're going to speak about Rung Pratete or something like that, something Southeast Asian-y, which I would love to cover, but I don't want to cover your turf. So I'm going to focus in a little bit on a perspective on Australia. And the topic is strategy, security, and diplomacy. And I thought, we talk about these terms a bit glibly sometimes, and I thought we'd just unpack them a little bit in the Australian context and see what this means for us. Because let's start with security. First, when we're talking about security, what on earth are we talking about? Well, of course, it's a huge gamut, right? It's just about everything everywhere all at once, right? It's economic security. It's about trade. It's about foreign direct investment. It's about the rules of negotiations. It's about all sorts of international transaction arrangements. It's environmental security. We're talking about all sorts of issues relating to climate change and the use of fossil fuels. And in Australia, there's a huge debate about nuclear energy, whether we should go down that path or not, and how much we can rely on wind and solar to cover the peak demands and the troughs and so on. Then there's political security and there's human security. And, this is actually quite a big domain that people in the military, and I'm a former military officer, so something that tends to be kind of pushed to the side as not all that consequential. And of course, what we've seen I grew up in the analog era. We're now, as I say, I'm an analog guy in the digital era. We've gone through the fourth industrial revolution, or we're going through it now, and everything has changed. So now computers and computer security or cyber security has become way more consequential. We've gone from being web enabled to web dependent and in turn web vulnerable. And that vulnerability is something we're only just kind of touching the sides of. We're seeing the vulnerability with the breaking of the undersea cables as a possible precursor of a much more significant consequential disruption, great disruption, if you like. So there's also maritime security. And we've talked about this. I was listening into an earlier session, listening to a couple of my Australian colleagues talking about Pacific and Southeast Asian affairs. And it was great to hear them talk about maritime security and the Forum Fisheries Agencies, Pacific Islands Forum. There's a lot of dimensions to maritime security, economically, in terms of protection against piracy and people smuggling and drug smuggling and a range of other dimensions. Then there's territorial security, which is good old-fashioned security of your homeland, which is what I grew up with as a former military officer. And of course, what we've seen since the 9/11 is a huge emphasis on homeland security. So border defense forces, home defense, border protection, all sorts of fairly muscular, militarized agencies that perform this function of homeland security. So we've got the economic, environmental, political, cyber, human, maritime, territorial, and homeland security. I don't know about you, but that nearly a bit does my head in. There's so many dimensions to it, right? So that was just the first pillar, right, of this topic, which is massive. The second one is on strategy. And here I'm drawing a little bit on a paper I wrote a couple of months ago, published online, called Adapting to Polycrisis, a proposed national security strategy for Australia. And what I point out in this is that, well, firstly, going back to what is strategy? I mean, what are we talking about? What does that word even mean? Because everybody has to have a strategy for something, and I'm from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, so I'm very strategic. Let me just tell you, because I put the word in it, right? Aren't I? Well, I'm joking, of course, because I think it's useful to distill down the essence of strategy, and I would contend that the good old-fashioned definition still works, and that is strategy is it's essentially ends plus ways plus means, right? So what are your ends you've got? What do you want to do? What are the ways or the means of the ways you can do it, and the means, the resources you've got? So I think for Australia, well, firstly, for all of us, the ends we want are essentially linked to what I call what's been described as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Basically physiological, social, and actualization needs. This is what we all aspire to. We want to be safe, healthy, prosperous, and we want that for our kids, for the next generation. That's in a nutshell what we're after, right? That's the ends we want. What are the means we've got? Well, in Australia's case, and this, every country is different, but these are the categories that Maslow, not Maslow, is going to come to me. The 1948 paper. Anyway, the categories, the title will come to me. But the elements are of geography, of natural resources, industrial capacity, military preparedness, population, national character, national morale, quality of government. Now, the Lowy poll, the Asia Poll Index, gives you a sense of some of those categories of power. Hans Morgenthau finally came to me. His elements of national power really, I think, a useful way of thinking of the means we have at our resources. And when we think about what the great remarks by Tomohiko Taniguchi earlier on about the work of Shinzo Abe and so on, I think we can think about them in the various categories. And it's useful to kind of disentangle the elements to think through what we've got, what our options are, and then what we can do about it. And of course, the ways. Well, that's then gets down to the kind of what we think is the strategy. What we tend to talk about strategy, and for me, when we think about this, I think it's useful to distill this down to this idea of what I've put in a Venn diagram as great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges, accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. Great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, spectrum of governance challenges, people smuggling, drug smuggling, terrorism, breakdown of law and order, etc., civil war, and the accelerated effect of the fourth industrial revolution, the Internet of Things, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, robotics, unattended sensors, etc. All of those things, no one has mastery of that. But in Australia, we've had a few cracks at it. I like to say Australia is a middle power with small power pretensions. We don't like to be in charge. We like someone else to do it. The Americans or the Brits, or Tomohiko Taniguchi told us about the great leading role of Shinzo Abe, and in that respect, we're kind of happy for others to take the lead on the Quad, on FOIP, on ASEAN, things like that. But we do recognise in Australia, by and large, that we need to kind of organise ourselves and think rationally and with some efficiency in how we allocate our resources. So we've had defence white papers. We've come up with a national defence strategy. We've come up with a foreign policy white paper, admittedly quite a number of years ago now, the 2017 foreign policy white paper, or what I call Australia's foreign policy plan B. Why? It was introduced when Donald Trump last came into office, and it kind of still resonates as being largely true, because, we're worried about him being uncomfortable with the rules-based order, the international institutions that the United States helped set up, which for middle power countries like Australia are incredibly important. We rely on the rules working. We rely on, we send a ship of raw materials, be it coal, iron ore, or something, it arriving safely, unmolested, the transaction taking place, and us being paid for that sale. That doesn't happen by accident, and it used never to happen. We take it for granted that these things can. This is something that's actually more fragile than I think we recognise. So that's on the strategy. Now there's the third pillar, the diplomacy one. For Australia, that's manifested itself in us reaching out to, as I say, as part of that plan B, if you like. What do you do when you're not sure about what the United States is going to do? Well, you double down on the relationship as best you can. So for us, that's included AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US arrangement, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. Doubling down on our relationships across Southeast Asia with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Doubling down on our relationships with Pacific Islands foreign countries, the PIF. And we've just seen Australia sign some great deals with Tuvalu, with Nauru, and with Papua New Guinea, and Fiji as well, amongst others. The Quad, with seeing Australia engage more in the Indian Ocean space, particularly with India, in a way that kind of, it's kind of obvious. It should have been going for a long time, but it's great to see it come to fruition. Our engagement with the Indian Ocean Rim Association, but particularly our engagement with our most important, clear, immediate neighbour, Indonesia. This is a relationship that, it's a prickly one because we have a game of snakes and ladders with that. With Indonesia, we incrementally go up the ladder, improving things, and then we go down the ladder, beat over beef, over boats, over spies, clemency, Timor, Papua, Jerusalem, you name it. We have an uncanny ability to be clod-hopping in our relationship with our most important neighbour, Indonesia. Still, we're getting better. We've got the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. We've got these new ramped-up strategic partnerships, and there's scope for doing more. Manis is the Indonesian word for sweet. It could be a maritime forum for Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Singapore, and anyone else who wants to join. There's a range of mechanisms there. We have a lot of challenges. Anthea Roberts talked about the 6 faces of globalization. As we think about strategy and diplomacy and managing the security challenges, we have to bring everybody on board. It's easier said than done, but I think we are facing what could be described as strategic, unrestricted competition. It's riffing off the book by those 2 Chinese colonels who wrote that book in the late 90s called Unrestricted Warfare. We have a binary in English of peace and war, and that title threw us off. What it was dealing with was legal, economic, psychological, and political warfare. I think the word warfare has thrown us off. It's really competition. It's going gangbusters. Competition isn't all bad, though, and I think we should be looking positively at it. And that's why I think we should be adapting. That's how I think we should be adapting to what I see as the polycrisis. Thank you for humouring me and for having me on the program. Thank you.